Our next session, which is about the way that the combination of targeting and media and product development is all shifting in before our eyes, will be moderated by Jackie Leo. And thank you to Jackie for filling in relatively last minute on this. And I just, she's, you could basically say her bio, she's the editor of the Fiscal Times, which she is, but she has a very eminent history in the media business. She has been the top editor at Reader's Digest, Family Circle, and Consumer Reports, and a bunch of stuff on the internet in more recent years. So Jackie, take it away.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry we're not doing this by the pool, but you'll have to forgive us. Here we all are. If you all had a product to sell and needed 70% of the universe of potential customers to buy your product in order to be successful, what do you think your investors would want to know? What were you smoking? That's the flaw in the Obamacare marketing plan. And here's why. According to the Center for Healthcare Research and Transformation in Ann Arbor, when you exclude millennials with children who either qualify for Medicaid or who are covered by employer plans, and then exclude those on their parents' coverage, the universe shrinks to 4 million people. Now, everyone, including our president, is in the marketing game. And that's probably everyone in this audience, whether we know it or not. And that's certainly true for our 4 panelists. From my left on, Samir Arora is CEO of Glam Media, which is the #1 women's lifestyle media company, reaching 90 million unique visitors a month in the US alone. His challenge is finding ways to target a mass market audience. Conrad Feldman, I made a mistake here. Darren Clark is CTO of YP. Guess what that stands for? Formerly the Yellow Pages, the 127-year-old iconic print directory, and he's rebuilding this brand on the internet. Conrad Feldman is CEO of Quantcast, which is a company that mines data, analyzes patterns, and interprets consumer interests. And almost every website that you know or know of, including my own, uses Quantcast as one of their beacons of what's going on within our own audience. And finally, Allison Lowry is CTO of Simulmedia, a company that knows more about you than you do. They find high-value TV audiences on undervalued inventory. So targeted advertising, what used to be called one-to-one marketing, is now ubiquitous. And whether you're marketing a product, an idea, or even getting someone to vote, it's personal, and it can be intrusive, and it's effective. But it has its downside, and our panel will be talking about the 3 competing power groups of today's marketing: the brands, the consumer, and the media itself. So I wanted to start with a question for Samir, because we just saw a story in Adweek that once again says, I know that half of my advertising dollars work, but I don't know which half. It's an old adage. So when you're looking at targeted advertising, is it really working? And how is it working in terms of the consumer? And what are some of the conflicts that you see? What's the best of it, and maybe what's the worst of it?
That's a really good question. I think, if I step back, I spent about a decade at Apple, so I usually look at things from the consumer perspective first, and both kind of stated and unstated needs. So the question is, which part of advertising is desirable for us, all of us as consumers? And usually the quick answer is none, but then you go a little deeper and say that's not really true. Mediums that understand how to do both contextual and well-targeted things appeal both to men and women. So, if you pick up a Vogue or a scuba diving magazine, it's been pre-packaged for you very well. So you have an expectation of what it would be, both the content and the ads. Same thing for prime time, same thing for Super Bowl and any event base, where there's the form of the publishing has evolved over years, so the consumers know what to expect. we and the internet are a pretty young medium. What's great about that is that inherently, this medium, because it's post-print, post-television cable, is much, much smarter. So one example is, it's not that hard for a cable operator to have the technology to figure out if you've just purchased a car, that right after that, you're probably not the best audience to target showing another car ad, because all it's going to do is invalidate what you did. It's really very simple technology-wise to do that. So what I love about the technology part of our business is if you start from the premise that actually advertising is desirable when done well, and that's a combination of context, who you are, which is personalization, the technology of the data itself of what you're doing and where you're doing it, but brought together in a way it anticipates and is smart, then people love it. And where it doesn't, it becomes very intrusive. So to answer your question, on a scale, generally speaking, advertising when you're communicating, like typing an email, seems very intrusive, at least to me. So that's not an area that I want advertising. It's very creepy. That doesn't work. And advertising when you're in a context of a lifestyle or something you love, any passions, there the combination works very well. So the real problem that the internet is helping solve, and there are players who do it well, and there are players who don't do it well. And I realize usually it's when they don't know the context of what you're doing, that even if they can target a person, as we know and we'll hear from someone here, you're the same person watching TV at prime time and middle of the night. The audience is not changing. Mm-hmm. Why are the CPMs 100 or 1,000 times? Something else changed, right? So there's a whole system that actually created that context. Or the ads in the front of the magazine versus the back of the magazine. There's a lot of history to why that happened, that packaging. So I think I'm a very strong believer that if you package content and advertising or offer the consumer a choice to see something ad-free with a subscription, the consumer is in charge, and you do it well, smartly, intelligently, actually the payoffs are very high because it's inherently better for the consumer.
Okay. But Allison, you were telling me a story earlier about Amazon, which I thought you might want to share with the audience because they had a couple of problems.
They did. I was reading a brief article about the new book about Jeff Bezos in a business magazine, and they were relaying a story that someone had gotten email marketed on a product that they really didn't want to be targeted on. And apparently he has his own private email address that anyone can address to him, and he follows the customer feedback. And
you mean Jeff Bezos has his
Jeff
own?
Bezos, yeah. Jeff at Amazon.com, in case anyone's interested in sending him an email.
Write that down.
And he does, read these emails, and he was, quite taken aback by the feedback that his marketing department had marketed someone for a sensitive product. And they had quite a bit of discussion about it, and it really impacted the way they were doing marketing. Mm-hmm. But back to your original question, if you think about what is targeted advertising, right? It's about increasing the relevance of the advertising to the consumer, regardless of where it's on the internet, magazines, billboards eventually, mobile or TV. And it's about, understanding, what is relevant to that viewer or visitor or consumer. And that has some really good possibilities, and it has some less good possibilities, depending on, how invasive the targeting can be. And so, the things that I think about a lot are, how to facilitate that brand-consumer relationship, right? Because the consumer is actually, the brand is engaging you to build that relationship with the consumer, right? Through your technologies or your web properties or your targeting capabilities or whatever. So how to facilitate that relationship in the best possible way, and increase the relevance, the educational content for for the end consumer.
Okay, but let me ask a question to Darren, because I think you have a unique challenge. You are, now stop me if I'm wrong, but your customers are small business owners in local areas, are they not?
Correct.
So you're already carving out the universe in one area called small business owners. And then how are you going to target them beyond what you already know, that they have a small business in a regional area?
Yep.
How do you get where you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, for us, as a quick aside, we left AT&T. We were, the last Yellow Pages company that were part of a phone company. We left last May through a private equity transaction. And the interesting thing when you leave the phone company is, we got to take a whole new look at our business. And one of the big things that we realized is that we couldn't just keep pushing YP as a small business brand. We had to push it also as a brand for consumers. Because guess what? When you go and you try to sell a small business an advertising program, they start asking about Yelp and Google and those sorts of things. So as much as we focus our sales channel on the small business side, we're really pushing our marketing message now towards the consumer. And we have an interesting thing in our business that not every marketer has. We have search traffic, right? So we get to see display, which, with display you can access RTB, you can build these rich profiles, you can build kind of a point of view of who people are at a very granular level. Search, though, tells you what people want, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to get done. So for us, the marketing force is really on the consumer side, and then we really try to marry those two things together of what you might see out in the kind of advertising ecosystem around profile data, but marrying that to search, and that gives us, I think, a stronger, more effective way to not interrupt users, but actually remind them to help them get things they're trying to accomplish, help them get those things done.
Okay, so search works for you on that,
Absolutely.
that level. But now we get to Quantcast, which is looking at a lot of data from a lot of different points of view to try to come up with not only a profile of individuals, but of different sets of individuals. And you have your finger on how many at any given point. I mean, the number of people that and users that you're looking at is enormous.
It is, yeah. So we're measuring media consumption from most of the online population, and using sophisticated computer software to analyze this vast amount of data and create relevance for consumers, to make advertising more targeted. Advertising has always been targeted. People have to decide which newspaper to put an ad in, where to put a billboard, and so on. But there's a lot of waste in that process. And with digital media, we can make advertising much more relevant by being finer grain in terms of how we deliver advertising. And I think the opportunity is to create a much more relevant experience for consumers. You sort of mentioned that advertising can be intrusive, and I think there's two aspects to that. One is advertising can be interruptive, and outside of search, I'd argue advertising needs to be somewhat interrupted, either consciously or subconsciously, to have an impact. And it's worth remembering that the vast majority of the media that we consume is supported by advertising. It's an enormous industry. So there's going to be some level of interruption, but interruption's much worse when the interruption is with content that you find irrelevant. And when advertising is made relevant, two important things happen. First of all, it becomes useful. It becomes content for the consumer. But secondly, you need far less of it to create the economic exchange that is necessary for free access to media. So on network television, there can be as much as 20 minutes of advertising every hour. And the reason for that is, for most people, it's irrelevant. Because it's irrelevant, for most people, marketers will only pay so much for it.
Sure.
Publishers need the income to support programming, which is expensive, so they have to show more advertising, and us consumers have to sit through more advertising. If you were
So then they go to Netflix, and that's the end of broadcast.
And people can exercise that choice, of course, and you have a subscription model in certain cases that works. But it's worth remembering, for all of the great services that have been provided under subscription models, the vast majority of media that we all consume is ad-supported.
Okay, well, let me ask all of you, let's just take an interruption or a disruption of advertising that has yet to come, and let's just talk about Twitter for a minute. I know we didn't discuss this. How is that going to play? Here you had a very interesting IPO, did pretty well, all things considered. A company that hasn't made any profit, hasn't been nearly as successful in terms of its economics as Facebook or Google when they launched their IPOs. What's going to happen to all these users who are used to a very clean experience, a very simple experience, when those ads start to appear in order for them to make money? Tell me what you all think. I'm sure you've talked about it endlessly.
I'll start. I think it's very rare if you start with a consumer promise, free, not ad supported, can you change it and survive? But there are exceptions to that. So the question is, Facebook that was not ad supported, where you had your own feed, and suddenly you have ads like McDonald's appearing in it. So it's not just Twitter's issue. I think the real issue is you don't launch a magazine or a pilot without advertising because you want the consumer experience to be in the packaged media. So internet is, especially us in Silicon Valley tend to have a very strong effort of, build the consumer base first and then advertising will follow. And that is the current way almost every new internet media company is being formed today, social media company. So what Twitter is trying to do has been done before, but it's very, very rare that the consumer actually stands for it, accepts it. But they do. So the question is, when Twitter started sponsored tweets, that didn't create intrusion for most users of Twitter. As it gets more intrusive, we'll see whether it works or not. And Twitter will also find other business models to do that. But my belief is the higher up in content you are, the more difficult it is to introduce advertising later. The higher up in communication you are, you have to find other ways to monetize because generally people don't want to be interrupted in communication. So the reason I say that is if you look at most social networks, so this is, Twitter is not a social network from that regard, which have feeds and started from people connecting to people. Traditionally about 80% or 83% of usage is communication. The second usage, which is over 70%, is photos.
Yep.
And those are actually the two hardest to advertise areas because you're looking at the photo, you're not going to look at the ad. So if you look at even Instagram or Snapchat today or any of the big Asian companies of IM that are expanding, very difficult to monetize. But then you go into feeds, which is, I think, thanks to Twitter, who created feeds, and Facebook pivoted and created a feed based on Twitter, we're now experiencing something very new. And what I would consider that is, it's no longer just social graph. It's a people interest graph, so it's a social interest graph, and a content interest graph that's being created on top of it. So by that I mean, when you look at something like a Pinterest, which is sitting on top of Facebook or Twitter, you're actually connecting to people at an interest or passion level. Twitter's used that way too, and Facebook is beginning to be used that way. And all of these have one thing in common, which is pretty amazing, which is the amount of time a consumer spends in the feed is somewhere between 4 to 8 times more than consuming content in the feed itself. So actually the feed has become where you spend the time. So that would be like saying the TV Guide browser is 8 times of all television viewership. Think of the power the social platforms have right now, where the amount of consumer time being spent in the Pinterest. So one example is in Tumblr, it's the same. In Pinterest, every photo is repinned 8 times.
Wow.
Right? So if you think about what's happening is that the actual relationship of the consumer to media is changing right now, and I've never seen anything like that. So from that regard, companies like Twitter that are feed-based are actually sitting in the ecosystem outside of content, and almost like search was, where you go to Google, then you leave and you come back. I want a yoga retreat. You go back and forth. So we've been trained to do something we never did in print or television media. It's a new use. Now I think feeds, discovery, and mobile discovery are actually the places of consumption, not just the places to find media.
And you think they're eclipsing search?
I think they're an and. I think they're a very serious and. So for a company like Glam, search is traditionally been a very low driver of traffic. So globally we reach about 300 million consumers across all of the sites, and search this year declined to under 9%. There's not even 10% because we've never focused on search. For us, Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and all other feeds have been where people found things that's relevant to you. But I think if you take the notion that there's a space of publishers and content providers where you consume the content, right? So if you think about last week, Twitter turned on content consumption within their feed, right? So this is a very big change. It's not a minor change. The amount of use in Twitter is going to skyrocket, and some to the detriment. The negotiation between the publisher and Twitter is not clear. One example I leave with is, when YouTube started, 80% of its usage the first 18 months was inside MySpace. And then MySpace went down, YouTube became very big. Right now, for all accounts, somewhere between 20% plus of YouTube usage is inside Facebook. But Facebook does not allow YouTube to run an ad in the video you're watching, hosted by YouTube inside Facebook, right? That's a complete change of power.
Yeah.
So I think Twitter is actually in a place where being in the feed means they are not only just a news feed, they actually have the potential of being a consumer feed. But I think Facebook is at a whole different level.
Yep, got it. Anyone else want to comment on this?
I think a lot of what Samir said about kind of the value of the feed and kind of how that's analogous to search in some ways, I think that's an incredibly important point because it's an application that leads to content consumption, right? If you think about it, search does something similar. But I think in the near term, I think they're going to keep mining the tonnage of their users the same way Facebook does. They're going to make some money. But I think when you get into kind of these different notions of the social graph, or even think of like a commerce graph or a commercial graph, as consumers start expressing affinities and relationships with brands and businesses, I think that there's a whole new set of opt-in marketing channels. And you see some of this out there, but it's very immature right now. And I think we'll see that in the future where that becomes a pipe between the user and the brand, and you see offers and things moving between them.
I think anyone that's got a large consumer base obviously needs to be very careful in terms of how they modify the service and that they're not inundating their consumers with irrelevant information, whether it's content or advertising. But equally, they've got a huge engaged audience worldwide. They've got a lot of smart people, and they've got a couple of $1 billion in the bank now. That gives them a lot of opportunity to experiment and to find the right combination of services that will sort of support the consumer base and generate the revenue that they need to grow.
Absolutely.
Right, and I think that having that access to all of those relationships, they have to be very careful. I was reading an article not too long ago about LinkedIn had done some advertising, and they were taking benefit of the folks in a given person's network that were engaged with an advertiser, and they were showing images of those connections to a person in the context of advertising, right? And they got really fast negative feedback on that, and they had to take it off. But the strength of having access to all those relationships is really powerful, but where is what I call like the creepiness boundary, right? Where is it that you cross that line as the owner of and having the visibility of all these relationships, like a Twitter, like a LinkedIn, like a Facebook?
Well, what Allison is saying, I think, is that the consumer ultimately is in charge, has been all along, and that's all of us, all of you. And with that in mind, it's time for questions from the consumers. Yes, sir.
Hi, Mark Bonchek with Orbit. My question is about how advertising may be changing completely. If you look at what Nike's doing with digital sport, the Nike Plus running community, the Fuel Band, is that advertising? Is it something else that they advertise on? What is it, and are we going to see more of these kind of owned engagement platforms or something like that?
Yeah, I think, fundamentally, if you look at almost every CEO, CMO today, in the three buckets, the way they view reaching consumers, paid media is what we're talking about, which is advertising, but to a very large level, owned media and earned media, or word of mouth, has now become a platform for them to consider. Now, some of this is not new. It's just technology is new, right? I mean, if you look at companies like Nike and you look at companies like Apple, Apple's been doing evangelism and word of mouth for a very long time. So the platforms they're using to do those has changed and technology has entered the picture, but and therefore the amount of money they're spending on those is going to increase. But if I look at content marketing or publishers as, brands as publishers, I think that's a pretty serious theme right now. And I look at it like a continuum. So you've got pure content that's either subscription or ad supported, nothing to do with advertisers. And then you start going into that plus ads, and then you go into content with product mentions, and then you go into full advertorial, right? So there's a full range. And every brand is really playing with these in every combination to see, if I have a recipe database at Williams-Sonoma, if you go, have fantastic recipes, why does Williams-Sonoma have that and a publishing business while actually the business comes from selling products? It's building that two-way relationship. So I think that's here now. It's a tremendous force of change, and there's a lot of conversations going on between what's the role of the new CMO. Is that, to the theme of this conference, do you need a technologist to be a CMO? And what's the real role of the CIO? Do you need a marketer to be the CIO? And I really believe it. I think Mark Andreessen says it really well, which is, technology or software is eating media. That's what he means in terms of what I think about it, that there's a fundamental shift happening right now in the use of technology for doing things and tasks and business processes we were used to without technology.
Well,
that's a big change.
Let me ask a question before we go on. Does that mean that we all have to hire data scientists in order to have a company? I mean, are we in the business now of having to figure out?
Increasingly, most businesses that deal with large amounts of data will have data scientists, absolutely.
Well, even small amounts. If you want to succeed, from everything we're talking about here, it's all going to be about parsing the data and figuring out the target.
Well, and bringing together different data sets and sources, right? So, we've been bringing together internet-based, visitor data for a while. Now we're bringing together the interaction of a viewer with their television set and what content they're consuming. Mm-hmm. You have all the offline data that we're bringing together, and soon we're going to be bringing together the data that's being collected through our apps on our phone, and
sure.
and our geo-based data from our phone or from our car.
Absolutely,
right?
From the car.
And it's going to be informing not only, who we are in terms of what we consume as it relates to content, but where we are and how long we've been there and how fast it took us to get there, et cetera, et cetera.
Who our friends are.
Who our friends are. So bringing all that data together, is no small feat because it's very diverse.
And of course, that's not restricted just to media and advertising, but I think that there is a reason that media and advertising has been so pioneering in terms of the use of big data and the application of data scientists. And that's that there's a very clear feedback loop in terms of the benefit that you're getting from developing an algorithmic process, applying it to a particular business. You see results, and those results can then fund additional development and research. And it's not coincidental that so much of the sort of fundamental research and development and software tools that have been released to open source for big data have come out of companies in the advertising space.
Yeah, that means you two have to start paying your guys even more, so in order to keep them before everybody else poaches them.
Just a small comment. I think one of the beliefs we shared, as a technologist, I'm a technology media person, not a media person, was that when the data gets really large, it's very difficult to make any sense of it. That completely got disproved this year because of the NSA findings, right? If a government can actually look at data that's in impossible amounts of data and make sense of it, that means companies will actually have ways to be able to use it very smartly. So I think it's not just hiring data scientists, it's actually the entire stack of data, which is hiring companies, who hire scientists. And the differentiation will still be for a brand or a content platform, what's your point of view, right? So an Apple's point of view is fundamentally different than Amazon, though both of them have cloud services. And that comes across very clearly. So, a Glance point of view will be to use that data because our DNA is completely different. What we care about consumers is really different than somebody else. So I think as the stack evolves, it's really interesting to see which large corporation rise. But I do believe it is a scale business. I've always believed that. This is not a niche business with data, which is very hard. You have to have large amounts of data and large amounts of consumers to actually make meaningful sense of it. But the point of view is, not talked about a lot, which I think is why this data is really interesting to have.
No doubt about it. Questions?
My name is Carlos Dominguez with Cisco, and I'm questions really more as a consumer. When I'm hearing you talk, I'm kind of having this balancing act in my brain, which I call a value exchange. On one end, what value am I retrieving from your application, your ad, whatever it is, right? On one end, and then the second one is on privacy. And I'm balancing and making a decision. When you get old like me, you worry about things like that. So 2 questions. Number one, is there, at least in my humble opinion, every T's and C's for contracts on when you're subscribing to a service has like 58 pages. Does anyone read them, by the way? Has anyone
No.
gone through? Right, so back to one of the questions that he mentioned is simplification might be an interesting strategy in doing that. And then secondly, as a question, besides simplification, are you kind of approaching generations differently? Because I know what I do versus what my kids do is very radically different.
Yep.
Can we, yeah, go ahead.
On the issue of simplification, I mean, right now the entire thing's in disarray, right, between kind of where the regulatory and legislative side is versus where kind of those of us in the industry, the publishers. So I agree that there needs to be a big push for simplicity, but between the DAA and the guys who are pushing the privacy, Consumer Protection Privacy Act, there's no kind of center of gravity to where that thing's really moving forward. It's languished for a year and a half, but I agree. I think simplicity is hugely needed. We were just talking backstage about the fact that, at some point, just like people did, you mentioned PRISM, people woke up, right? We all suspected the NSA was doing that for years. It was a joke, right? But until we saw the smoking gun and the Snowden stuff, that's when people woke up. And so it'll be interesting when American consumers kind of actually understand how much data they're generating, where it's going, what's happening with it. So it'll be interesting to see which way it goes. On the second piece, is that the... Yeah, the millennials are much more likely to share. They'll share a lot of stuff, but I think there was a survey out a couple of weeks ago that showed that even them, they're starting to get mindful of location data and when they want to let that out and when they don't want to let it out. So I think until consumers really wrap their head around it or there's a big event in the press, I think people are just going to kind of stumble forward in the current construct.
Are you guys seeing any changes from the data you collect generationally?
Well,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's different patterns of usage, different types of media that people like to consume, different combinations of devices and things like that. And whilst I think there are certainly differences in terms of how people may share content, I don't think that because people are sharing more information, it really changes their perceptions of privacy. There's still things that people would react badly to if you were to do. Right. And I think that's the case with any technology. How it is used can have very different implications and outcomes, and what we have to do as an industry is develop the right processes and standards and the right communication. To your point, you are seeing a trend towards the challenge with things like terms and conditions is sort of balancing readability for someone who's not a lawyer, with also making sure you haven't left ambiguity for an agreement that's legal, and you're beginning to see both of them there. Some explanations of what the document contains and pointing out key sections. And you see it a lot now when people are changing policies. They're providing really clear, simplified explanations of how that happens. But it's still a balancing act between sort of the desire to make it easy to consume and understand and making sure it's specific enough and doesn't contain ambiguity. I don't think it's solved yet, sorry.
Yeah, no. And is it about having a default opt-in or a default opt-out, right? So like when you're, entering into these relationships, are you entering in assuming that, your relationship is with the first party, whatever that means, and that you get to actively decide or not? And the example that I gave around LinkedIn, they had said, oh, no, you opted in. It was a default opt-in. And I think that's going to make a huge huge difference as well in terms of simplicity. And as it relates to the different generations, I know I feel way different about like the information that's being shared than some of my younger counterparts. Now, I'm always thinking about like how far, just because you have the data doesn't mean you should do anything with it, right? I mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Right.
So, how much benefit does the consumer get from being, better informed, knowing what all their choices are, being better educated, and developing a clearer relationship or a stronger relationship with a brand that they want to build that relationship with. And I think that's going to change a bit with the generations as well.
I agree.
I think, just a short comment, I think the trust, which is what we're talking about, between a consumer and, in this case, a media company, varies not only by subgroups and generations, but also varies greatly within the same industry between companies. So an example of that is, I want Netflix to give me a better recommendation after I saw Breaking Bad. I have no problems about privacy, and most generations feel that way. Anytime my PowerPoint on Microsoft crashes, which it does a lot, I always say don't send them the data. I just think about those two relationships I have as a consumer in my head. Apple asks me every single time I'm in a map application, do you want to share this? That's a very high order that they decided privacy was important. So my sense is it's about trust, and it's about long-term trust as a media owner. And then it really does vary by generation or even subgroups, women versus men versus age and gender, of course, and what people want. There's a word that is very simple. It's beyond a word, something is creepy, right? So you don't want to be there. And then there's a big range that you want to really allow the consumer to participate in building trust with you. And my simple belief is companies either care or they don't care.
Right.
And if you care, then your whole DNA of the company cares, and you work on this very hard. And other companies don't care, and you know it as a consumer. So
Yeah,
you don't want
I believe
to want to share anything with them.
One last question, I think, if we could. Yes. Yes. Right there. Thank you.
Hi, Jim Steichleather with Dell. And my question is going to kind of tie together the last three concepts, because one of the things we've been working on in our Foresight group is focusing on where consumers see value. And one of the things I think is facing the advertising industry is you can have all the big data in the world and all the analytics in it, but if you can't get to the consumer, it's worthless. And so we're either facing governmental regulation on required opt-in, or the fact of the matter of the work being done in the security space with big data and AI is basically increasing the ability of spam filters to effectively preclude you from being able to get to the consumer at some point. Which then brings up the two things we've been seeing. Diane Rasmus talks a great deal about the serendipity economy, the fact that the value of something is a function of the time, place, who I'm with, what I'm doing, what's the last thing I did, which is a whole lot of information I need to share. And Seth Godin, now he popularized, it's been around, and talks about permission marketing. So does the nature of advertising have to shift, to your point, and Fukuyama wrote the book Trust, all economics is based upon trust. Does advertising have to shift first to gain trust and then get permission to become the trusted advisor that I'm going to give all my information to, so that you will only give me a message when it fits what I need right this moment?
It'll be a shift, not a grind. Or it'll be a grind, not a shift. I don't think one will stop and the other one will start, but they're going to grind against each other, just like how traditional media has with emerging media and online media. But eventually I think we'll get there. I think the question about Nike and their experiences, when you start to see kind of the framing of the brand come together with mobile and social and technology, you end up with someone having an experience instead, right? And they might have bought a product, but you're giving them something bigger, and you end up giving back more to the brand because they pulled you into that experience. I think that's the future, is it's no longer going to be as transactional. It's going to be about loyalty and pulling people into your world.
Anyone else to finish up? Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Thanks, dear.
So now we're going to have a quick break and come back here at 3:45. Don't forget the app. It's got a lot of useful stuff in it. See you at 3:45.